Armenians are heading to the polls in elections called after a disastrous war with Azerbaijan. Armenia lost large swathes of territory in the long-disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region in a ceasefire agreement. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan is hoping to renew his mandate, but his popularity has dropped after he signed the truce brokered by Russia. Observers warn the conflict could easily flare up again, and there have been reports of unrest at polling booths. DW correspondent Nick Connolly is in the Armenian capital, Yerevan. Nick, why are these snap elections necessary?
Well, Tommy, as calm as this Sunday election day looks in Yerevan, Armenia has been through a hell of a few months after that defeat last year. You mentioned tens of thousands of refugees from Karabakh here in Armenia now. An army that is very angry still at its political leadership. They think they could have changed the course of this conflict had they been given the command to throw all the resources at countering that Azeri attack. Instead, a ceasefire was signed with Russian mediation that basically also gave away territory that the Azeris hadn't even taken on their own. It was Armenia handing over territory, withdrawing troops. So essentially, this election is a referendum on that ceasefire, and a ceasefire that is looking increasingly precarious. We were up in the mountains just the other day where Azeris and Armenians are just a couple of meters apart and tensions growing there. Let's have a look.
Almost 3,000 meters above sea level, but only a few meters apart. Armenian and Azeri soldiers stare each other down. Just a matter of months after a brutal war saw thousands killed and war crimes committed against prisoners. At this proximity, tempers can flare. Commanders eventually put an end to this brawl, but recent weeks have seen repeated shooting and Armenian soldiers kidnapped. It's a pattern repeated up and down Armenia's hundreds of kilometers long border with Azerbaijan. Until last autumn's ceasefire, the two countries' international border was in practice little more than a line on the map. Armenia controlled both sides of the frontier as part of a buffer zone around Nagorno-Karabakh. The problem now is that these two adversaries have very different ideas as to where their new border post should be. Armenia accuses Azerbaijan of moving its positions deep into Armenian territory.
Azeris crossed the borderline, official state borderline, and came inside the Armenian territory about 3 kilometers. In my personal opinion, that this situation must be resolved as soon as possible to don't have further escalation.
The Azeris say they have different maps dating back to the 1980s, maps which show a very different borderline. Down below, in the Armenian border village of Kut, locals can hear the shooting in the mountains. But for some, it's more personal than that.
My 3 sons are up there now.
That hill in the middle?
Yes.
Where your sons are? How old are they?
They're 23, 24, and 27. 3 days ago, their friend was killed up there. He was just 18 and had just joined the army.
Andronik tells us his neighbours are too scared to take their cows up to their usual mountain pastures to graze after Azeri forces shot at herders, and their cows simply wandered away. A tragedy for villagers surviving on little else.
If the Azeris come here now, they'll trample us. There aren't enough of our troops here, and lots of theirs. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying here. I've already had to move 3 times.
Like most people in this Armenian village, Andronik was born in Azerbaijan, a refugee from the two countries' first conflict back in the late 1980s. The war, he says, has never really ended, merely been paused. Some ceasefires have lasted for years, some just hours. The current ceasefire is looking more precarious by the day.
Nick, the vote is expected to be close. What can you tell us about the two main candidates?
Well, as people, they could barely be more different. On the one hand, you have Robert Kocharyan, the former president, someone who's very close to the Kremlin, someone who is a part of the elites, the financial elites who have controlled the economy of this country for the past few decades of independence. Nikol Pashinyan is charismatic street politician, as it were, someone who actually was in direct conflict with those elites over the last decade, someone who was challenging them and eventually got to power through street protests back in 2018. This is causing extraordinary polarization. People here at this polling station where I am in Yerevan telling me that they've basically stopped talking to half of their friends because they can't accept that their friends could seriously countenance the other candidate, because it's just not a moral possibility for them for this country. So really, tensions running extremely high after that war, after that defeat. In terms of the bigger picture, where Armenia goes from now, there isn't much an alternative to Russia. Russia is guaranteeing Armenia's borders. There are Russian bases here, Russian troops along Armenia's border with Turkey. Yes, Russia didn't do more to protect Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, and there's a lot of disappointment there. They were expecting Russia to do more to counteract Azerbaijan, that it had a lot of support from Turkey. But essentially, it's a choice between full alignment with Russia, with Kocharyan, or a kind of alignment light with some kind of integration, not integration, but engagement with the West, with Europe, under Nikol Pashinyan. But the bigger picture is there is no other game in town for Armenia than Russia. That is the brutal geopolitical reality here, and lots of Armenians aren't particularly happy about it.
And looking at that divide you described, will the current Prime Minister's supporters accept defeat?
Well, that is the million-dollar question. We've heard already that both sides have organised big rallies for tomorrow when the first results are expected. We've heard of scuffles at polling stations, gas pistols being fired, accusations that the government is using its resources for illegal pamphleteering, illegal electioneering on what should be now days of quiet when the people go to the polls. Given also that personal dimension and people's really kind of extraordinary reaction even to their friends and their family about this political choice, yes, this is a very nervous moment here in Yerevan and a moment of tension inside the country but also along its borders.
Okay, DW correspondent Nick Connolly there in Yerevan, Armenia. Thank you for explaining that to us.